Good evening. I'm glad you've joined me tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find a comfortable position, let your shoulders soften, and allow your breath to slow. The day is behind you now. All that matters is this quiet moment. Tonight I'll be here with you, guiding your mind gently into rest. My name is Jonathan Holly, and together we'll drift into a world of mystery, calm, and sleep. You don't need to think or solve or do anything at all. Just let my voice carry you deeper into stillness. Now, let's begin our mystery story for tonight. The fog had teeth that morning, gnawing at the edges of London like a starving beast. Detective Alaric Thorne watched it seep through the gaslight haze, swallowing the cobblestones, the lamp posts, and at last the pale figure laid out before him. She was young, perhaps 20, perhaps ageless, her face serene as though death had only lulled her to a gentler dream. Around her the air reeked faintly of burnt linen and turpentine. But what held Thorne's gaze wasn't the body. It was the painting propped against the wall, a perfect likeness of the woman's face. The brush strokes shimmered under the lantern light, too delicate, too knowing, and it was signed in a trembling script, a T. No paint could account for its texture, its uncanny hue a gray so deep it seemed to breathe. When Thorne touched the canvas, his fingers came away smeared with a fine dust, like soot, like ash. "God preserve us," murmured Constable Wicks, clutching his coat tighter. "Who paints a corpse before it cools?" Thorne said nothing. His thoughts drifted back to the letter that had summoned him here, written in an anonymous, fevered hand. "Come to Lambeth Wharf before dawn. Another has been perfected, perfected." The word pulsed through his mind like a curse. He knelt, studying the woman's delicate features. There was no sign of struggle, no wound, only the faintest trace of gray along her lips, as if she had exhaled smoke in her final breath. The artist had captured that moment precisely. Too precisely. The lantern flickered. Somewhere in the fog, a bell tolled 5, and then Thorne saw it, a small smear of ash along the base of the easel. He brushed it with his glove, revealing the curve of another letter hidden beneath the grime. Not a T, but a LT, his own initials. He straightened, heartbeat thundering. The fog thickened, curling like smoke from a painter's brush. A whisper of laughter seemed to follow it, a dry, hollow sound that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Wicks shivered. "Sir, you look pale. Shall I fetch the coroner?" Thorne forced his voice steady. "No, not yet. There's something I need to confirm first." He turned back to the portrait. In the wavering light, the painted woman's eyes seemed different, softer, pleading, almost alive. The ash upon her cheek had shifted, ever so slightly, as if disturbed by a sigh. And when the lantern guttered, he could have sworn he saw her lips move. Morning brought no mercy. The rain came down like thin needles, washing soot and silence through the streets of Lambeth. Thorne had not slept. The woman's portrait lay locked in the evidence room, but he could not banish it from his mind, the trembling brushwork, the human dust that clung to the surface like a secret refusing burial. By noon, the coroner's report arrived. No signs of poison, no trauma, no clear cause of death. As if the breath simply fled her, the report read. The ashes found beneath her nails matched those on the painting. When the analyst examined them under a lens, he whispered a single word that curdled Thorne's blood organic. He walked through the narrow corridors of Scotland Yard, the smell of damp wool and pipe smoke following him like ghosts. His colleagues had begun to whisper again, using that pitying tone they reserved for men who had once been brilliant but had fallen too deep into their own shadows. They all remembered the Harrogate case, though no one spoke of it aloud. One that had left Thorne's wife buried and his reputation bleeding out in the papers. A single failure, and London never forgave. At dusk, Thorne found himself drawn back to the corpse's lodging, a narrow house overlooking the river, its windows shuttered as if afraid to look upon the world. Inside, the air was sharp with the scent of turpentine and something sweeter, like decay wrapped in roses. The landlady trembled when she spoke. She was quiet, sir, painted at all hours. Said her patron was a genius, said he could make the dead live again. In the corner of the studio, Thorne found a second canvas face down, half buried in coal dust. He turned it over slowly and froze. It was a study of hands, delicate and spectral, emerging from a gray mist. His pulse stuttered. The technique was unmistakable. At the bottom corner, etched into the paint with the edge of a blade, were the words, "We are only beautiful when we are ending." A sudden sound startled him, a faint scratching behind the wall, like fingernails on wood. He pressed his ear to the plaster. The scratching stopped, replaced by a single hollow knock from within. He stepped back, revolver drawn. The silence thickened, pressing close as the smell of ashes crept through the cracks in the boards. And then he saw it through the slit of a hidden panel, a human eye staring back at him, perfectly still, perfectly dry. He tore the panel open with shaking hands. Behind it was no person, only a canvas rolled tight and bound in twine. It unfurled with a dry hiss. Another portrait, this one of a man, his face gaunt, his expression trapped between agony and revelation. The man was himself. For a long moment, Thorne could not breathe. The portrait in his hands, his own likeness, stared back at him with a gaze, too knowing, too resigned. The artist had captured the hollows beneath his eyes, the furrow carved by years of sleepless cases, even the faint scar along his temple where memory itself had once bled. But there was something else, something wrong. The painted Thorne was weeping, not in overt tears, but in faint streaks of darker gray running down his cheeks, as though the ashes themselves refused to stay still. He could smell the faint tang of smoke rising from the pigments, feel the chill that clung to the fibers of the canvas. It was as though it had only just cooled from fire. "God in heaven," he murmured. He looked again at the inscription at the bottom corner, those same carved letters, A.L.T., his initials, his mark, but he had never painted it. Never even seen this work before tonight. A distant memory stirred nights long past, before grief had settled into his bones, before his wife's pale face had haunted every waking thought. He had painted once, not professionally, but for solace, to still the tremor of his mind. After her death he had burned every canvas, every one. He touched the surface again, and the texture yielded slightly beneath his fingertips, warm, pliant, human. The knock came again, then 3 faint taps from somewhere deeper in the house. Thorne turned sharply, revolver raised. The light from his lantern trembled across the walls. revealing streaks of gray dust smeared like fingerprints. The scratching sound resumed, faint and rhythmic, leading toward the cellar door. He descended slowly, each step groaning like a confession. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the unmistakable reek of turpentine and old smoke. At the bottom he found an easel splintered, blackened as though someone had set fire to it and then changed their mind halfway. Nearby, jars of pigment sat in careful order. Each was labeled not with color, but with names: Margaret, Elias, Rebecca. The lids were sealed with wax. Thorne's stomach turned. He unscrewed the first. Inside, a fine gray powder clung to the glass. Ash. He stumbled back, knocking over the lantern. It rolled across the dirt floor, casting jittering light against the far wall end, illuminating a half-finished canvas there. The face was still forming, brush strokes ghostly and half-real. He recognized the line of the jaw before the thought even formed. It was him again, but this time the eyes were open, watching, and then a voice low, almost tender, spoke from behind him, close enough that he felt the breath against his ear. "You shouldn't have come back to painting, Alaric." He turned, heart hammering, but there was only the fog curling in from the broken window smoke without a fire. When he looked back, the canvas was empty. Thorne awoke in his own bed, though he had no memory of leaving the cellar. His clothes still reeked of turpentine, and his palms were blackened with soot. The fire in his hearth had long since gone out, yet the room carried the faint warmth of something recently burned. For a moment he wondered if he had dreamed it all: the portraits, the whispers, the jars of ash labeled like relics of the dead. But when he rose, he found smudges of gray along his bedsheets, fingerprints leading to the writing desk. There, resting atop a blank page, lay a single sable paintbrush. Its bristles were wet. He reached for it cautiously. The handle was engraved, not carved by hand, but scorched, as if branded with his initials, A.L.T. The knock at his door startled him. Detective Thorne? It was Constable Wicks, his face pale and rain-soaked. He clutched his hat nervously. "Another one, sir." Whitechapel this time. The same hand. Thorne followed him into the carriage, his mind still fogged with the taste of ash. As they rattled through the gas-lit streets, he stared out at the city, the lamplight shimmering in the puddles like oil upon a wound. Every shadow seemed to move. Every reflection seemed to bear his face. The room in Whitechapel was narrow and cold. The smell hit first sharp, chemical, and sweet. Turpentine again. The body lay upon a cot, her hands folded neatly across her breast. She could have been sleeping, save for the faint gray powder that dusted her skin. On the wall above her hung the inevitable, a portrait, masterful and obscene in its precision. But this time Thorne noticed something new. Beneath the portrait, scratched into the plaster by a trembling hand, was a sentence. "He paints with what they were." He leaned closer. A soft rain tapped against the window panes. His eyes caught on the brushstrokes, the subtle blending of grays and whites, the way the ashes seemed to move within the pigment like shifting smoke. He thought of his own hands, the stains beneath his nails that would not wash off. He thought of waking with no memory of leaving the cellar. "Sir?" said Wicks quietly. "You're shaking." Thorne stepped back from the portrait. His breath came shallow. There, beneath the signature, almost invisible beneath the soot, was the outline of a fingerprint. He pressed his own hand to it. Perfect match. A cold certainty crept through him, slow and merciless. "Wicks," he said, voice hoarse. "Find out who delivered the first letter, the one that summoned me to Lambeth." The constable frowned. "You mean the anonymous note?" "It came through post, no return, no sender." Thorne's mouth went dry. "And the handwriting?" "Odd thing, sir," Wicks said. "Looked almost familiar. We thought it was yours." The room seemed to tilt. Thorne grasped the windowsill, staring out into the mist where the gaslight flickered like a dying eye. In the glass reflection beside his own face, another shape lingered. The following morning the fog returned dense and yellowed, clinging to the windows like old parchment. Thorne stood in the cramped parlor of his lodging, staring at the brush on his desk. He had scrubbed it clean the night before, but still the faint gray sheen remained, as if the bristles refused to forget what they had touched. He had not slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw faces half-formed, whispering through the smoke. His own voice spoke to him from the darkness. "You made them beautiful. You made them live again." When Wicks arrived, Thorne could barely look at him. The constable carried a folder under his arm, his usual joviality smothered beneath exhaustion. "Sir, we've got records. The victims, every one of them, sat for portraits within the last month, each signed by the same alias, the Alchemist of Grays. No one's seen the artist, but his works fetched small fortunes through private dealers." Thorne frowned. "And the medium?" Wicks hesitated. "That's the strange part, sir. He claimed his pigment was sacred dust, said it contained the soul of the subject." A chill ran through Thorne. Where were the paintings sold? Not in galleries and secret exhibitions. One's being held tonight at the old Durham house abandoned after the fire 20 years ago. Thorne's pulse quickened. Prepare a carriage. Durham house loomed like a corpse over the Thames. The front door hung from its hinges, blackened by soot. Within, the air was thick with mold, and something sweeter the scent of varnish and decay. Dozens of paintings lined the cracked walls, lit by candlelight. Each face stared down at him, too vivid to be dead, too silent to be alive. They were beautiful, every one of them, rendered in soft ash gray that seemed to shimmer when he moved. But what chilled him most was that he recognized them all. The Harrogate victims, his own failures, every soul he had failed to save. He turned a corner and froze. The final painting at the end of the corridor was draped with a black cloth. A plaque beneath it read, "Unveiling at midnight, the detective." His breath faltered. "Sir?" Wicks whispered. "Who's hosting this?" Before Thorne could answer, the candles flickered. A man stepped from the shadows, tall and gaunt, his hands stained gray to the wrists. His eyes glowed with a feverish light. "Welcome," the stranger said softly. "I've been expecting you, Detective Thorne." Thorne's revolver trembled in his grip. "You're the alchemist?" The man smiled. "I am what you abandoned, what you burned away. You named me long ago when you first mixed ash with oil." He reached up and tore the cloth from the final canvas. The portrait was not of Thorne as he was, but as he would be older, hollow-eyed, covered in soot, a brush in his hand, painting a body that looked just like the one lying in Lambeth Wharf. Wicks gasped. "God save us, what is this?" The stranger's smile deepened. "It's a prophecy," he whispered, "and it's already drying." The stranger's words hung in the smoke-heavy air, each syllable like a match dropped into oil. Thorne's pulse thudded in his ears. The portrait before him seemed almost to breathe, the ashes shifting softly as though stirred by a sigh. "You've no right to use my name," Thorn said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Whatever this is, it ends tonight." The alchemist tilted his head, smiling faintly. "Ends? No, detective. It culminates." He stepped closer, the candlelight catching the fine dust that clung to his coat like frost. "You burned your grief, and from it I was born. I am the fire that remembers." Wicks raised his pistol. "Stay where you are." The alchemist did not move. "Look at his hands, Constable," he murmured. "Tell me whose ashes cling beneath his nails." Thorn glanced down and froze. The gray smudges were darker now, ingrained into the creases of his skin. He rubbed furiously, but the color would not fade. The alchemist's smile widened. "You've already painted more than you know. Enough?" Wicks shouted. "You'll come with." A hiss of air cut him short. The nearest candle flared violently, spilling molten wax. The smell of scorched cloth filled the corridor, and in that instant of chaos the alchemist vanished. They searched the house by lamplight, but every room had changed. The paintings were gone, every wall bare save for pale outlines of where the frames had hung. Only the black-draped easel remained, and on it a new canvas still wet. It was Wicks, his face, his uniform, even the fear in his eyes perfectly rendered. The constable staggered backward, hand trembling. "That wasn't here a moment ago." Thorn reached out to touch the paint. It was warm. When his fingers withdrew, ash clung to the tips like blood. Wicks bolted for the door. "Burn it, burn all of it." But as he crossed the threshold, the lamps guttered. For a heartbeat, the world went black. Then came a single sound, a strangled cry, then silence. Thorn's lantern flickered back to life. The doorway was empty. Only a faint drift of gray dust swirled in the air, settling on the floor in the perfect outline of a man. He stood frozen, unable to move, until he noticed something new on the easel, a second figure forming beside the first himself. The brush strokes were deliberate, careful. A handprint his own marked the corner as signature. He stumbled backward, heart pounding. "No," he whispered. "This isn't real." From somewhere deep in the house came a voice, smooth as varnish. "Reality is only what the artist chooses to keep." The candles flared again, painting the walls in trembling gold. And upon those walls, one by one, the vanished portraits began to return. Thorn staggered through the echoing corridors of Durham House, lanterns swinging wildly. The returning portraits lined the walls once more, each face alive with silent accusation. Some smiled faintly, others wept. All seemed to watch him move. Their eyes caught the trembling light and held it like coals. At the end of the hall hung Wicks's likeness, already finished. The paint had dried to a smooth, matte gray, as if the pigment itself had drunk his soul dry. Beneath it, Thorn saw the faint inscription again, A.L.T. He pressed his palm against his chest, feeling the irregular hammer of his heart. "This isn't me," he whispered. "He's using my name." The portraits disagreed. Their lips seemed to part in the shifting shadows. A low murmur rippled through the gallery voices, bleeding through canvas, mournful, reverent, despairing. He caught fragments. "You painted us. You promised to remember. You burned the proof." The sound grew louder until it became almost human sobbing. "Stop. Thorn hissed, backing away. "You're not real. You're pigment and cloth." But as he turned, one of the canvases brushed his arm. It was warm. He froze. Slowly, he turned back. The portrait that had touched him was that of a young woman, her eyes downcast, her lips trembling. He remembered her name only when it was too late. Margaret, the first victim? Her lips moved again, barely a whisper. "Why did you come back?" His knees nearly gave. "To stop him," he breathed. "To end this? You can't end what you began," she said softly. "He paints because you let him." The words struck him like a hammer. No, I destroyed everything. I burned it all, and from those ashes he rose." Her voice was calm, pitying. Her hand painted, impossible pressed, gently against the inner surface of the canvas. The fabric rippled under her touch like water. Then a sudden crack of thunder outside, the windows shuddering with rain. The whispering ceased, replaced by the faint rustle of a brush moving across canvas somewhere behind him. Thorn turned slowly. At the far end of the corridor, a figure stood at an easel, back to him. The lantern light caught the edge of a palette gray, black, bone white. The painter moved with quick, elegant precision. Each stroke echoed in the stillness. "Stop!" Thorn shouted, rushing forward. The figure didn't turn. He seized the lantern, throwing its light over the new painting, and froze. It was unfinished, but the features were forming quickly. The eyes already gleamed with dreadful awareness. It was Margaret again, but alive, her mouth open, as if crying out from inside the paint. The brush halted mid-stroke. The alchemist's voice drifted from the shadows, greater than, "Do you see now, Alaric? I only perfect what you cannot forgive." Thorn stepped back, trembling. "What are you?" The voice smiled through the dark, greater than, "Your hands, your grief, your art? I am what's left when repentance burns too long." And then the painting's eyes blinked. Part 8. The smell of burning linen. The air in Durham House had turned heavy, oppressive. The scent of burning linen hung above the mildew and dust, faint yet unmistakable, an odor Thorn knew too well. The alchemist's work always left that ghost of fire behind, like the memory of a cremation. Margaret's painted eyes still glimmered with impossible life. When Thorn stepped closer, the illusion faltered for a heartbeat. He saw the texture of pigment, the rough weave of canvas, and then it shifted again, rippling as though the portrait breathed. He forced himself to look away. The lantern shook in his hand. "This is madness," he muttered. "You're a fraud. A butcher who plays with ashes." From somewhere beyond the corridor came the steady scrape of a palette knife. "Fraud?" The alchemist's voice was smooth as lacquer. "No, detective. I am truth made visible. I only reveal what death conceals." Thorn followed the sound into the central hall. There, among toppled frames and ruined draperies, stood a wide mirror cracked down the middle. It reflected not his face, but a different room one filled with unfinished canvases, a studio of pale light and smoke. He stepped nearer. The reflection shifted, and he saw himself at an easel, brush in hand, painting furiously while gray motes floated through the air like snow. His reflection's mouth moved in silent rhythm. When he touched the glass, the cold bled into his bones. A whisper bled through from the other side. "We're not so different. You and I, we both make peace with the dead in our own way." Thorn's voice cracked. "You killed them." "No," said the reflection. "You immortalized them." A sound drew his gaze back to the real room. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and faint gray fingerprints began to appear on the inside of the glass one, then another pressing outward. He stumbled backward. The lantern slipped from his grasp and shattered, spilling oil across the floor. Flames licked up the warped boards, quick and hungry. Smoke began to rise. Through the crack in the mirror, the reflection smiled. "Burn it again, Alaric. You always turn to fire when truth shows its face." He turned to flee, but the portraits that lined the hall seemed to lean forward, their faces luminous in the firelight. Every eye followed him. Every mouth parted in silent reproach. By the time he reached the door, the smoke was thick, searing his throat. He burst into the night air, gasping. The rain fell hard, sizzling against the flames devouring Durham House. He watched until the roof caved in, the fire casting grotesque shapes across the river fog. When the final beam collapsed, he whispered to the darkness, "You can't survive this." But as he turned away, he saw something on his sleeve, a faint smear of gray, fresh, still warm. And from behind him, beneath the crackle of fire, came the whisper of a brush stroking canvas, slow, patient, and very much alive. The fire's reflection rippled on the surface of the Thames, an orange wound spreading beneath the black sky. Thorne stood at the river's edge long after the last beam of Durham House had fallen, watching the smoke drift like a procession of ghosts. The wind carried with it the faint scent of turpentine and scorched linen sweet, poisonous, familiar. He had meant to end it. He had thought fire could erase what it once gave birth to. But as the embers cooled, he saw shapes forming in the haze, outlines of faces Margaret, Wicks, the others blinking into being before the smoke swallowed them again. He staggered back, nearly losing his footing on the wet cobbles. His mind whispered treachery. You burned a house, not a ghost. He was never inside to begin with. At dawn, the yard found him still there. The constables exchanged glances, but said nothing. Their superior looked like a man returning from a grave he could not find. They reported that no body had been recovered, no trace of the mysterious alchemist. Only a single painting had survived the fire miraculously, untouched, recovered from the riverbank. When Thorne unwrapped the canvas, his breath caught. It was not a portrait, but a landscape, the view across the Thames from where he now stood. In the corner, faint but deliberate, was the same signature ALT. His hands trembled. He looked down at them. The soot was gone, replaced by a faint silvery residue that gleamed in the weak daylight. He rubbed at it furiously, but it only sank deeper into the lines of his skin, as if absorbed. That evening, Thorne returned to his flat. The silence within greeted him like an old, lover-soft, suffocating absolute. He poured himself brandy, stared into the fire, and tried to convince himself that what he had seen in Durham House was the delirium of exhaustion, nothing more. Then he noticed it. His easel, which had been dismantled years ago, stood in a corner once more assembled, waiting. A blank canvas rested upon it, pristine and white, though he had no memory of buying one. On the nearby table lay a single brush, its bristles darkened with something gray. The smell of turpentine filled the room. He backed away slowly, every nerve screaming, until his heel struck something soft. He turned. Upon the floor lay the scorched remains of an envelope. Only a few words had survived the burn. You can't destroy art, Alaric. You can only complete it. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. The firelight wavered. For an instant, he thought he saw movement on the blank canvas, a faint outline forming, like smoke taking shape in air. He told himself it was trick of the flame, a mind unraveling after too many sleepless nights. But when he looked again, a single gray fingerprint had appeared in the lower corner, his own, and from somewhere within the walls came a quiet, rhythmic sound, the steady brushing of paint upon canvas. The flat smelled of damp and turpentine, and yet there was something else lingering, something sweeter, metallic, like the remnants of smoke long extinguished. Thorn could not shake the feeling that he was being watched, not by eyes of flesh, but by the patient gaze of ash itself. He approached the easel cautiously. The canvas remained blank, yet the faint gray smudge in the corner seemed to pulse as if breathing. He held up a trembling hand and touched it. The residue yielded to his fingers, warm and gritty, like dust pulled from a coffin. A sudden cough echoed from the hearth. Thorn spun. No one was there, just the firelight dancing over warped floorboards. But in that moment, the soot above the mantel shifted and settled into letters. You began it. His stomach knotted. His hand shook as he tore open drawers in search of something, anything, he could use to fight back. Among old case files, he discovered a notebook he did not remember writing. Inside were sketches hastily scrawled, portraits in various stages, faces contorted in silent horror, each labeled with a name he recognized. And at the very last page, the words, "When the brush chooses you, you cannot refuse." Thorn sank to the floor, the notebook slipping from his trembling fingers. Outside, London hummed with the indifferent sounds of horses and foghorns. Yet inside, the air thickened until each breath felt like inhaling fine gray powder. He thought of Margaret, of Wicks, of every victim whose ashes had become pigment. He thought of the alchemist and the fire at Durham House, and he knew, with a certainty that made his knees buckle, that the line between hunter and prey had already shifted. The room went cold. The candle flickered violently, then extinguished, plunging him into darkness. In that pitch, he felt the faint brush of something against his cheek soft, deliberate, human. He froze, every instinct screaming that movement meant danger. Yet when he reached up, he touched only air. Then came a whisper, low and patient. "Breathe, Alaric, or we cannot begin." He realized with dawning horror that the canvas had changed. Under the gray smudge, delicate outlines were forming. A face his own, pale and hollow-eyed, emerged from the void. Each stroke was measured, exact, deliberate, as if guided by hands he could not claim as his own. He stumbled backward, tripping over the notebook. The face on the canvas blinked, the eyes narrowing as though recognizing him. For a moment he felt the same thrill he had once felt when painting in solitude, the strange intimacy of creation. And then the room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing closer, the faint smell of burned linen and turpentine turning suffocating. Thorn's mind reeled. He realized the truth too late. It was not the alchemist who had drawn him here. It was he himself. Every obsession, every failure, every unfulfilled promise had led him to this final canvas. The dawn had no mercy. London lay under a heavy fog, a gray sea stretching into every alley and quay. But Thorn did not step outside. He could not. The flat seemed to have shrunk around him overnight, walls leaning inward, floorboards creaking beneath phantom weight. He was trapped in a studio that existed both in reality and in the contours of his mind, a place the alchemist had constructed from his memories, his guilt, his obsession. The canvas stood before him like a sentinel. Gray powder rose from the lower corner, forming the faint impression of a hand, then another, then the sweep of a brush, a choreography of shadows only he could see. Thorne understood the unthinkable. The painting had begun without him, and yet somehow with him. He was both creator and creation, medium and subject. A mirror leaned against the far wall. Its surface rippled, not with reflection, but with possibility. Thorne's own face stared back at him, older, hollowed, etched in gray dust. Behind the reflection, a faint studio appeared, filled with half-finished canvases, jars of ash, and brushes that moved on their own. The alchemist's voice, smooth and distant, drifted through the air. Every painter leaves a trace, Alaric. Some stains cannot be washed away. He felt compelled to approach the mirror, drawn as though by gravity. Every step stirred a fine dust beneath his boots, gray particles rising like incense. The reflection's eyes seemed alive, holding secrets the world had not taught him to fear. The mirror shook faintly, and then the reflection stepped forward, reaching a hand through the glass. Thorne recoiled, nearly tripping over a fallen easel. When he regained his balance, the hand in the mirror pressed against the other side, perfectly aligned with his own. The air felt cold, thin, and impossible, his heartbeat echoing in every nerve. The brush on the canvas quivered. A face emerged slowly, delicate and precise. Margaret. Then another. Wicks. Then yet another. Each one unfinished, each one alive in gray strokes. Their eyes followed him with accusation and longing, pleading for remembrance. The alchemist's whisper came again. This studio is eternal. Every shadow is a witness. Every stroke is life and death combined. You belong here as much as they do. A gust of wind or perhaps smoke swirled through the room. The lantern flickered and went out. Thorne stumbled, coughing, choking on the fine powder in the air. When he opened his eyes, the studio had changed. The canvases multiplied, the portraits crowding him, pressing closer, each mouth opening as if to speak greater than, "Paint us, Alaric." The studio had grown impossibly large. Every corner expanded into shadow, and yet, no matter where Thorne turned, the walls pressed inward with the weight of memory and soot. Canvases lined every surface, each bearing a face he had known, a soul he had failed, a life now trapped in gray pigment. Their eyes followed him, unblinking, accusing. Then he noticed them, figures emerging from the edges of the portraits, indistinct, pale as dust, faceless yet strangely familiar. They moved like smoke, drifting along the floorboards, brushing against him with cold, weightless fingers. He stumbled backward, heart hammering. "Who, what?" he whispered, clutching at the air. The whispering began, soft at first, then rising into a chorus of muted cries. The figures circled him, forming a ring of ash and shadow. Some carried brushes, small and delicate, like children imitating an adult's craft. Their hands, though spectral, left traces on the floor, fine gray powder marking every movement. "They are yours," said a voice behind him, smooth, low, infuriatingly calm. "Your apprentices, Alaric. Each one you abandoned, each one you failed to save. You taught them to wait in silence, to endure." He whirled, but the alchemist was nowhere to be seen. Only the shadows moved, and from within the thickening gloom, the faceless figures raised their brushes in unison. Gray dust lifted into the air, swirling around Thorn like smoke from a funeral pyre. Paint, they whispered in unison, though their mouths were blank. Or become ash yourself. Thorn's stomach twisted. He fell to his knees, staring at the nearest canvas. A faint sketch had already begun lines forming a figure on the white surface. He knew instinctively it would be his own likeness next. Each brush stroke would draw him closer to the void. Desperation clawed at him. No, I will not. But the figures advanced. Every step left gray smudges along the boards, marking his own flight in the studio. Every breath carried the sharp tang of turpentine and burned linen, making his lungs ache. His reflection, once confined to mirrors, now shimmered in the shadows themselves, moving independently, mimicking the alchemist's calm movements. You cannot escape your own hands, the reflection said. The apprentices know only what you taught them, that creation is eternal, that life is temporary, that ash preserves what flesh forgets. Thorn's mind spun. The brushes lifted, poised in the air without visible hands, and a faint wind carried the odor of charred pigment to his nostrils. The powder on the floor lifted, circling him in a whirlwind of memory and regret. He understood then. This was no longer a studio. It was a tomb, a gallery, a crucible of all the lives he had touched and failed. And in that realization, a cold certainty settled into his bones. He had become the master and the medium. The whisper came again, infinitely patient. Thorn staggered into what felt like another chamber of the studio, though its dimensions defied reason. The walls dissolved into a gray haze, yet every surface bristled with painted eyes, ash-dusted eyes, eyes that followed him with a silent insistence. Each portrait seemed to inhale, exhaling faint whirls of smoke into the air. The sound was subtle at first, then unmistakable, a gallery breathing. His knees buckled, but the figures circled him, guiding him forward with invisible hands. He stumbled past canvases that shimmered with faint motion, faces of children, of lovers, of strangers long dead, each rendered in pigment derived from ash, each holding a story of beauty, terror, or unfinished grief. Their breaths brushed against his neck, cold and delicate, carrying the scent of turpentine and old fires. "This is impossible," he murmured. His voice trembled. I can't be here." A faint laugh, dry and hollow, echoed through the haze. "You are here," said a voice he had come to know too well. The alchemist's presence was everywhere and nowhere, stitched into the very air. "You cannot leave what you began. The gallery is yours, Alaric. Every portrait, every face, every stroke, all are the remnants of your own hands." He turned, and for the first time he truly saw the expanse. Canvases stretched infinitely, stacked in crooked towers, leaning against each other like tombstones. The faces were frozen mid-breath, mouths open in silent sighs, eyes wide with remembrance or accusation. He realized with terror that these were not just portraits, they were prisoners. And he, whether he admitted it or not, had provided the medium that held them. A brush floated in midair, rising to meet him. Its bristles glimmered faintly, dusted with gray ash. It poised above the nearest canvas, a blank expanse that seemed to thrum with life. He stepped back. I "I won't," he said, shaking. "I will not paint them." The whispers intensified, layered like wind through a canyon of bones. Paint, breathe, complete, preserve. The gallery itself seemed to inhale, the gray dust rising and swarming like mist over a graveyard. Then he saw it, a faint imprint forming on the blank canvas. A hand, delicate and unmistakable, pressing through the surface. Not his own, yet shaped by him. Slowly a face began to emerge. It was his own, pale, hollow, with eyes wide and terrified. "Alaric," came a whisper from everywhere and nowhere. "Do you recognize yourself?" He turned to flee, but the walls of the gallery shifted, elongating into corridors lined with more portraits, more faces. The brushes hovered in the air like a forest of spiders, bristles twitching. The smoky scent of ash and varnish choked him. He understood the cruel truth. He could never leave. He could never destroy the gallery. Every step he took only carried him deeper into it, deeper into himself. And in that realization the gallery exhaled once more. Thorne's hands hovered over the canvas, trembling. The first stroke had fallen. Gray pigment, fine as ash, dusted his fingers as though reluctant to leave the brush. The gallery's whispers had grown louder now, layered, insistent, a chorus of memory and accusation. Each inhale of the smoky air carried a story, a fragment of grief, a breath of life. He pressed the brush to the canvas again. The bristles yielded smoothly, forming a line so delicate it seemed to float above the surface, suspended between creation and decay. He recoiled at the intimacy of it. Every movement of the brush seemed guided by an invisible hand, as if the alchemist, or perhaps something older, were teaching him the secret language of ash. A low murmur drifted through the gallery. "It remembers what you forgot." Thorne froze. He had forgotten so much. The faces of his failures, the promises left unkept, the gentle sighs of those who trusted him and died. Each stroke seemed to draw those memories back, their weight pressing against his chest. The brush paused. The face on the canvas, a pale likeness of himself, was nearly complete. Eyes wide, mouth half open, hair disheveled as though wind from some otherworldly source had tousled it. But something more had emerged, subtle yet undeniable, a trace of another hand, another mind. It whispered in gray, faint and urgent, "I am your witness. I am your confession." Thorne's breath hitched. The realization struck him like a hammer to the skull. The brush, the pigments, the gallery, they were alive with testimony. Every face he had painted, every death he had witnessed, every ash dust particle that had brushed against his fingertips was evidence. And now, in this studio of shadows, the very tool he held had begun to confess on his behalf. He tried to set the brush down, to break the spell, but it floated, reluctant yet insistent, as though aware that it alone could speak truths he had tried to hide. The whisper came again, closer now, curling around him. "You thought fire could erase the debt. You were wrong. You are the medium, the witness, and the confession." A sudden draft stirred the gallery. Canvases shifted, portraits leaning toward him. The faces he had once known, Margaret, Wicks, the others moved subtly, as if nodding. The brush swept across the canvas with a life of its own, and Thorne felt a strange, terrible intimacy in surrendering to it. I am guilty," he whispered. The brush paused mid-stroke. The gallery exhaled a slow, mournful sigh that seemed to ripple through the walls and ceilings. Then, deliberately, It completed the final line of the portrait, a thin, gray tear falling from the painted eyes, a mirror to his own remorse. The gallery had grown impossibly silent. Not a breath stirred the smoke-heavy air, and yet every canvas seemed to pulse with expectation. Thorne knelt before the half-finished portrait on the easel, the gray dust rising in faint spirals from the brush bristles, filling his lungs with the bitter tang of ash. He dared not look away. Every time he had, the shadows had crept closer, faces twisting in silent reproach. He realized with a chilling clarity that the portraits were not merely images, they were sentient witnesses, each holding the memory of the moment when life had fled and been trapped in gray powder. Their gazes weighed upon him, a relentless jury, and he alone bore the penance. The brush moved in his hand, though not entirely under his control. The line it drew was both his and not his, forming subtle contours that mirrored thoughts he could not speak aloud. Guilt, obsession, grief, the ache of lost lives. He pressed harder, and the powder swirled into subtle shapes, an ash-dusted hand, a whispered mouth, the faint impression of lungs still drawing breath. Then came the first whisper, a single, fragile voice from a corner. "Alaric, do you remember us?" It was Margaret. Her painted eyes glistened as though the studio's dim light had caught a tear. Thorne's own chest ached, and the brush faltered in his fingers. The gallery responded as one. Every canvas shivered. Gray dust lifted from the floor and twirled into intricate spirals, forming the silhouettes of the other faces he had known. Wicks, Rebecca, eyes all emerging from the ash like ghosts, rehearsing a long-forgotten play. "You painted us," whispered Wicks, his voice now spectral yet immediate. "But only in fragments, only in ashes. You left us incomplete." Thorne sank to his knees, his forehead pressed against the cold wood of the easel. His hands trembled, smearing pigment across the canvas. He could feel the weight of every life he had witnessed and failed pressing through the brush, demanding recognition, demanding memory. The gallery seemed to breathe in response, inhaling thick clouds of gray. The walls shifted imperceptibly, stretching the corridors into endless lines of faces, all staring at him, all waiting for him to acknowledge their existence. Each inhalation of ash felt like inhaling guilt itself, choking him with the unspoken confession of decades. The brush lifted itself from the canvas. For the first time, Thorne felt that it was alive. It hovered, poised over the portrait of a face that had not yet been painted. And as he looked into the swirling gray dust, he understood the impossible truth. The next face would be his own. He recoiled. "No," he whispered, voice breaking. "Aye," but the whispers closed around him, soft and inexorable. Thorne stared at the canvas in disbelief. The face forming under the brush was unmistakably his own pale, hollow, haunted. Every line seemed to record decades of grief, every shadow a confession of failure. And yet the brush moved with a life independent of his trembling fingers, each stroke deliberate, patient, inevitable. The gallery breathed around him. Canvases leaned inwards, their painted eyes glimmering with expectation. The air was thick with fine gray dust, and each inhalation carried a sting of regret and remembrance. He felt it in his lungs, the ash of all he had destroyed, all he had failed to save, rising to claim him. He tried to step back. The studio shifted beneath his boots. Floorboards lengthened, walls curved, The corridors multiplied until escape seemed impossible. Every step carried him deeper into the labyrinth of portraits. The faces of the dead followed him, their eyes patient, their mouths opening slightly, as if whispering, though no sound came greater than, "You are ours," a voice murmured. Margaret's painted lips moved, faint and trembling. "The brush remembers what you cannot." He stumbled, collapsing to his knees. His fingers scraped against the floor, leaving gray streaks like blood across the boards. The brush hovered just above the canvas, poised over the forming self-portrait, as if it waited for him to surrender. And then the realization struck him with brutal clarity. He was no longer merely the painter. The ash had claimed him. Every failure, every death, every unfulfilled promise had converged into this moment. He was becoming both the medium and the subject, the artist and the painting, intertwined in a cycle that would never end. The whispers multiplied, rising into a chorus. "You created us. Now you complete yourself." Every stroke, every breath, every trace of ash belongs to the gallery. He reached out, trembling, and touched the brush. The powder clung to his fingers, warm and pliant, as if the ash itself recognized him. Pain shot through his hands as the brush guided itself across the canvas, drawing lines with uncanny precision. His own likeness emerged, fully eyes wide, lips parted in silent scream, hair tousled as though caught in the draft of some unseen fire. Thorne tried to speak, to command, to stop it, but the gallery would not allow it. The faces around him swirled in gray mists, merging with the brush strokes, asserting their dominion over his body, his mind, his will, greater than, "Do you see now?" The alchemist's voice whispered, everywhere and nowhere. The ash becomes the painter, and the painter becomes ash. There is no escape, and with that, the brush completed its final stroke. Thorne's reflection in the nearest mirror once, separate now, stared back at him as if trapped on canvas. A faint swirl of ash rose from his chest, mingling with the dust in the gallery, as though his body itself was yielding to pigment and memory. The gallery seemed to stretch endlessly, corridors folding in on themselves, walls lined with faces caught between life and ash. Thorne stood, or perhaps floated, before the central canvas, which now dominated the room like a window into some impossible, infinite void. The gray dust rose from the bristles, spinning in spirals, carrying the faint smell of turpentine and charred linen. He could not move. The gallery had become a cage, yet one constructed not of wood and plaster, but of memory and guilt. Every life he had touched, every brushstroke ever made, hovered in the air around him, forming a chorus of accusation and despair. Their eyes followed him, yet they did not blink, they waited. The canvas before him stretched farther than reason allowed, blank at first, but trembling as if anticipating the next act. A fine haze of ash began to rise from its surface, forming ghostly outlines of figures yet to be painted. Thorne's hand lifted almost instinctively, gripping the brush, and he understood. He could no longer resist. To resist was to dissolve into nothing greater than Alaric. A whisper carried through the gallery. 1,000 voices layered as one. The canvas awaits. The faces remember. The ash demands. The brush touched the surface. Lines appeared, delicate and precise, as though guided by the collective will of every soul trapped in pigment. Faces emerged, some familiar, some strangers' eyes wide, mouths parted in silent cries. all suspended in a gray eternity. The brush trembled in his hand, yet moved with inevitability. Each stroke recorded both memory and judgment, each line a testament to failure and devotion. The gallery responded. Canvases leaned in, dust lifting from every surface, swirling around him. The faces whispered in unison, "Finish, complete, remember." And with every stroke, Thorn felt himself dissolving, merging with the ash, his body becoming pigment, his thoughts dissolving into the gallery itself. He tried to speak, but the air had grown thick, heavy with smoke and ash. His voice was swallowed. The brush paused, suspended above the canvas, and the alchemist's voice, faint and distant, reached him. The eternal canvas belongs to all who painted and all who were painted. You are now part of it, Alaric. Your hands, your sorrow, your breath immortal in ash. Thorn's reflection shimmered in the smoke. For a moment he saw himself clearly, standing alone, alive, yet the image dissolved as ash spiraled up, entwining his figure into the gallery. The brush moved again, unbidden, drawing the faint outline of his own face alongside those he had captured before. He understood the final truth. The gallery would never end. The canvas would never be complete, and he would paint and be painted for all eternity. The gallery fell silent, not the living silence of a room emptied of sound, but the heavier, more suffocating quiet of ash settling after fire. Thorn stood before the eternal canvas, the brush trembling in his hand, yet moving as though guided by some force older than memory. Every portrait around him had grown more vivid, the faces clearer, the eyes brighter, yet each remained trapped in gray, bound between life and death. He looked upon them, Margaret, Wicks, Rebecca, the others, and realized with crushing certainty that they would never speak again, not in human voice, not in any language of the living. And yet their presence was a constant, a weight, a testimony. The gallery exhaled softly, the dust spiraling around him like smoke from an endless pyre. The brush hovered, poised above a blank section of the canvas. The room seemed to lean closer, expectant. A whisper drifted through the air, so faint he almost imagined it. Complete it, or remain incomplete. Thorn's throat tightened. He knew that the next face would be his own, not merely a likeness, but a confession, a record of every failure, every hesitation, every regret. The thought made his hands shake violently. He tried to pull back, tried to resist, but the ash on the floor surged upward, coiling around his ankles, binding him to the spot. He pressed the brush to the canvas. The line it drew seemed alive, pulsing with the rhythm of breath he could no longer feel in his own body. Slowly, agonizingly, the faint outline of his own face emerged, pale and hollow, eyes wide with the terror of recognition. The gallery exhaled. Every portrait leaned closer, faces pressing toward him in silence, watching, remembering. The silence itself became a presence, dense and suffocating. No whisper, no word could disturb it. The only sound was the soft rasp of the brush through the ash, marking every stroke of memory, every trace of life that lingered in pigment. Thorn realized then that the silence was not absence, it was witness. It held the weight of every soul in the gallery, absorbing their voices, their pleas, their confessions, leaving only the brush to speak truth in pigment. He felt the brush in his hand no longer as an object, but as an extension of himself. And as the final lines of his likeness formed, he understood with a chilling clarity. In the gallery, The brush and the painter were one. Every confession, every remembrance, every whisper of life and death existed only through the act of painting. And the act was eternal. The gallery exhaled again, settling into a stillness that was absolute, complete, and horrifyingly patient. Thorne stared at the portrait of himself, eyes wide in silent despair, and the canvas seemed to stare back, unblinking. The brush lifted. The silence waited. The gallery was heavier now, as if the air itself had thickened into ash. Thorne knelt before the eternal canvas, the brush poised trembling in his hand. Outside, London slept under a veil of fog, oblivious to the nightmare that consumed the detective in the studio beyond time. Inside, the gallery's silence pressed upon him like a shroud. Every portrait leaned closer. The faces of the dead, of the painted, of the half-remembered whispered truths in the shadows of his mind. Margaret's eyes glimmered with patient reproach. Weeks's lips twitched as though caught in a silent plea. He could not look away. Each gaze bore into his chest, weighing down his heart with decades of unacknowledged failure. The brush quivered, then lifted itself. Lines appeared on the canvas almost without his will, delicate, precise, yet charged with an unbearable intimacy. He watched in horrified fascination as the final portrait, the one he had dreaded most, took form. His own face stared back at him from the gray ash, pale, hollow, eyes wide with terror and guilt. "Finish," whispered a chorus of voices. Not command, not plea, but inevitability. Thorne swallowed hard, his throat dry. His hand shook violently, but the brush would not falter. Every stroke carried weight. Every life he had seen perish, every unpainted promise, every failure pressed into the bristles like blood into cloth. And he realized with a shudder that the act of painting was no longer his own. He was no longer master or witness. He was medium, pigment, and confession intertwined. He pressed the brush to the canvas one last time. Gray dust swirled upward, thick and suffocating. The portraits around him leaned forward, watching, remembering, judging. The gallery exhaled, a sound like wind over tombstones, and Thorne felt himself dissolve with each movement of the bristles. His body grew lighter, his bones hollowing, until he was nothing but ash and memory. The final stroke completed the portrait. The eyes his own blinked once, a gesture both human and impossible. The gallery shivered as if acknowledging the completion of a long, tragic ritual. Thorne, now fully merged with the medium, the brush, the dust, understood the ultimate truth. He had become the final witness, the last stroke of the eternal canvas. The whisper returned, gentle and terrible. Beauty is preserved in ash. Memory endures. The painter has become the painting, and then the gallery fell silent. The portraits no longer leaned in, the faces no longer shifted. Only the eternal canvas remained, pale and gray, holding within it every whisper, every failure, every sigh, every confession. Thorne's own likeness stared from the surface, unblinking. The brush rested beside it, dusted in fine ash, waiting patiently. The eternal work was complete. The gallery was still. No whisper, no shuffle of bristles, no sigh of ash stirred the air. The eternal canvas dominated the room, gray and unyielding, its surface etched with the faces of every life Thorne had touched, every soul rendered in pigment from their own ashes. And in the center his own likeness stared back, hollow-eyed and eternal. Time had lost meaning. Outside, the Thames flowed beneath a foggy dawn. Inside, the studio existed in its own dimension, a mausoleum of memory and guilt. The fire that had once devoured Durham House had become nothing but legend. Yet here, the gallery breathed with the life of those it held, silent and immutable. Thorn, or what he had become, stood before the canvas, brush poised and trembling, though his fingers were no longer flesh but fine gray dust. He felt the weight of centuries in the whispering of pigment, the silent expectation of ash. Every stroke he had ever made, every line drawn in grief or guilt had led him here. And now, at last, the final truth was revealed. He was no longer the detective, the man, or even the painter. He was the medium itself, the eternal witness, the living confession. The alchemist had long since vanished, a phantom of inspiration and madness. The gallery had never belonged to another. It had always been Thorn's creation, his grief given form, his obsession made flesh and powder. He had chased a murderer, sought justice, and discovered only that art, obsession, and guilt are inseparable, that the painter becomes the ashes he seeks to immortalize. A faint breeze or memory stirred the gray dust. The portraits shifted imperceptibly, acknowledging their final companion. Margaret's eyes, Wicks's silent plea, the countless faces, all fixed on him, on the brush, on the work that would never end. He lifted the brush once more, the final stroke dangling in the air. The gallery waited, patient, infinite. He understood now. To lay down the brush would be to cease entirely, to vanish into nothing. But to continue, he would remain a perpetual witness, a confession in motion, immortal in ash. The brush descended. The pigment smeared, forming lines that were at once his own and not his own. The dust rose, curling around him, intertwining with every portrait, every memory, every breath of the studio. And as the final line connected, the whisper came again, soft and unyielding. The painter is ash, and the ash is eternal. All that is lost is preserved. All that is forgotten is remembered. The candlelight flickered, and for a heartbeat, the gallery seemed to exhale in relief. Then the gray settled, dense and complete. Alaric Thorn, detective, painter, witness, and medium, had ceased to be a man. He was now the gallery itself, infinite, silent, immortal, and ash.